Week 18 of Aon's Public Affairs podcast was recorded August 4th, 2020.
Hello and welcome to the Aon's Public Affairs Update. Daniel Serota out of Aon Chicago. Today, I am joined by John Miner, National Practice Leader for our political risk business. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Daniel. Excited to be with you.
John, let's dig in here. We are in a pandemic. COVID has been around for the past couple of months. We're upwards of seeing political changes happening all across the globe. How, in your mind, has this impacted businesses' resiliency, to navigate these geopolitical stuff moving forward? Because I think it's important, for businesses to have a better understanding of what is it and what are the risks.
Daniel, that's a really important question. COVID-19 has had a hugely disruptive impact on virtually every business around the world. Some companies have fared better than others, for sure. Aviation has been hit hard, as has retail, hospitality, and tourism, which have all seen revenues plummet as a result of the pandemic. And if you think about the geopolitical landscape we're facing, companies hardest hit by COVID-19 may have a harder time navigating through these challenges. So, for example, we're seeing a sharp rise in civil unrest in many countries, both here in the US, Europe, and in many parts of the world. And this was really a trend we saw last year, where COVID is really accelerating that trend going forward. Protests, sometimes turning violent, are occurring with much greater frequency in the US and Europe and in many parts of the world. Last year, the protests in Chile alone, for example, resulted in billions of dollars in property and BI losses. We're also seeing an increase in domestic terrorism in the US and across Europe. You'll remember the mass shooting in El Paso last year, which targeted immigrants. This type of terrorist attack has increased in frequency and lethality, in fact, doubling in the last 3 years. So a rise in social unrest and terrorism is going to impact retail, hospitality, and tourism hardest at a time when their revenues are really already down and resources depleted. I think questions of resilience in the face of these sort of black swan or gray swan events, whether it's geopolitical risk, social unrest, climate change, or another pandemic, will be top of mind for many, if not most, companies going forward.
Yeah, and John, how, I would be interested in digging in further on the emerging market space. So how do you see COVID impacting that space overall?
So some emerging markets are faring better than others. China, for example, was hit pretty hard and early, but it's already starting to recover and doing pretty well. But there are other emerging markets that will be impacted more severely, for sure. Some emerging markets are just ill-equipped to manage a severe crisis, such as COVID-19, due to lack of resources, poor public health infrastructure, even the unavailability of clean water and sanitation just creates just a huge problem for many emerging markets. So you can see that COVID is going to impact some of these emerging markets even more severely than others. And really making matters worse, at a time when emerging markets need it most, capital is fleeing at rates even greater than what we saw during the global financial crisis in 2008. I mean, it's a huge withdrawal and much more sudden. So that's just creating a shock in these economies. Now, the more vulnerable emerging markets, we would say, would be countries that have a high dependence on export commodities like oil or food, because they're seeing both at a time when COVID is reducing economic activity and demand. We're also seeing a low commodity price hit those external revenues for those countries. So the impact of those two events combined are going to really impact those countries, sort of the oil exporters or the exporters of these agri-products. Countries that have a high dependence on remittances from abroad, their people, citizens living abroad, sending money back home, those volumes have plummeted right now. And so those countries that depend greatly on those remittances will also be really hard hit and vulnerable to this crisis. And then lastly, countries that have a huge amount of debt that's denominated in dollars or euros are also going to be very vulnerable right now. Over the last 10 years, emerging markets and frontier markets in particular have taken on a lot more debt through issuing bonds and whatnot. It's actually tripled over the last 10 years. So this really creates a huge risk of default. And it's not just the IFC and other developmental institutions that will be sort of shouldering the burden of this default, but traditional institutional investors are holding a lot of that debt. So they're going to be hugely impacted. Both the bondholders in a sovereign default situation, bondholders obviously are impacted, but but so are companies that are doing business with state-owned enterprises or companies that are involved in projects that are state-sponsored. All this, the prospect of sovereign default or depleted resources and revenues by an emerging market could have this kind of fallout of contracts reviewed or canceled altogether. The other impact that we're watching is foreign exchange. So as a country, their external revenue or export revenue goes down, their foreign exchange reserves become depleted. And so they need those foreign exchange reserves, right, to cover critical imports, to cover debt service, et cetera, that's dollar or euro denominated. So when those reserves get depleted, countries will often revert to controls, preventing other companies from accessing that foreign exchange. And companies operating in emerging markets need that foreign exchange, right? So they generate revenues in local currency. They need to convert them into dollars or euros to repatriate those profits back home. And so when a government imposes controls on companies' access to that foreign exchange, that creates huge losses for companies. So that's definitely one we're watching quite closely in emerging markets. And really, we haven't seen the full extent of COVID's impact on a lot of these emerging markets. So we expect that it's going to be much more severe and prolonged than many people think.
So, John, what do you see the future look like, right? And I think you brought this up earlier. Some countries in some areas haven't even seen the worst yet. I saw in the paper today that Africa is seeing a huge rise in increases in different lower villages than they've seen during this whole pandemic. And when you think about organizations in different countries and, when they're navigating the geopolitical risk across the globe, what should they be aware of and focused on in the second half of 2020?
So, Daniel, a number of things we see playing out the second half of the year as well as into next year. One, as I mentioned before, a rise in civil unrest. And as COVID restrictions are starting to be lifted in many countries around the world. In a way, those restrictions, the lockdowns, have prevented a lot of those grievances, that protest from occurring, right? So it's almost prevented a lot of that civil unrest from happening. And as the restrictions are lifted, you're going to see more of that civil unrest occur. So that is definitely something we're watching. And that's occurring in both developed countries, US, Europe, et cetera, as well as developing countries in the emerging markets. So look for a rise in those kind of activities. The other trend we're seeing COVID sort of accelerating is protectionist policies. So because of COVID and largely in response to COVID, governments around the world are just intervening in their economies in ways that really are unprecedented. So we saw a trend before COVID of a rise of nationalism, a rise of protectionist policies. And we see the risk that post-COVID, we're going to start seeing in many countries, countries not relaxing those sort of protectionist policies, but using COVID or the threat of another crisis to really pursue more protectionist policies. So we see trends of nationalism, trends of protectionism continuing to grow in many countries around the world, which could impact foreign businesses, particularly foreign-owned businesses operating in these countries. So these are two areas that we're watching quite closely. The third is just as the COVID crisis, continues, the more prolonged it is, the more severe it is, particularly its impact on emerging markets. We see that as potentially really devastating some of these more fragile economies, more emerging markets. So and those are some of the areas we're watching quite closely.
John, thank you for joining the podcast today. I really do appreciate your leadership and all you do in this space. I do want to mention for our audience, there is a report, the Aon Risk Map 2020, really hits, a high level of what we talked about here today, but really digs in on some of the geopolitical risk that is happening across the globe.
Thank you, Daniel. I've really enjoyed being on. I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
We are now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. Give us 5 stars. We hope you will continue to stay updated on what's happening in public affairs.
This information is a resource for Aon clients and business partners. It is intended to provide general guidance of potential exposures and is not intended to provide legal, regulatory, or medical advice. Due to the dynamic nature of infectious diseases, Aon cannot be held liable for the guidance provided. We encourage listeners to seek additional information from credible sources. Thank you.